we usually think about sowing and reaping in terms of doing bad stuff. Like if we sow bad stuff, we're going to reap bad stuff. But what about sowing good? And what about reaping good? Today we're going to talk about that in our Psalms, and David's going to teach us a valuable lesson. All right, good morning. Welcome to our Psalm series. Today we're going to be working through Psalm chapter 41. And when I started working on this Psalm, the one person that came to my mind in regards to this Psalm was actually my husband. Because he's kind of one of the good guys. He's one of those guys that would do anything for anyone. And he loves people, he gives, he helps, that's just who he is. That's how God created him. He's one of those guys that if you need something, you can have it. If you need one of something, he'll give you three of something. If you should be getting a $5 tip, he'll give you a $20 tip. Like, this is just who he is. I don't even think along those lines, but we'll be at home and the guy coming to, the spray bugs, let's just say, he'll show up, or the pool guy will show up, or the guy dropping off granite will show up, and Rob's like, do you have any cash? We need to give him a tip. And I'm always like, no, I don't have cash on me. But he always says, well, then you need to go write him a check. We need to tip these guys. And I'm like, Rob, we paid the company who employs the guy. Like, why do we need to tip them? And he's like, Lisa, these people work really hard for a living, and we need to be generous to them. And I'm like, he's so right. And I apparently totally suck at being a Christian, okay? But I just don't naturally think like that. I should, but it kind of never occurs to me to tip everyone who shows up at my door. But one day Rob wasn't home, and someone did show up, and I actually gave him a tip. And when Rob came home, I'm like, oh my gosh, you're going to be so proud of me. I'm like, I don't have a WWJD, what would Jesus do bracelet. I have a WWRD, like what would Rob do bracelet. But I laughed. I was telling one of our daughters one time, I don't know, we got on the subject of budgets, and I said, well, when we go on a budget, I have to have a line item for like Rob's tipping, okay? Because that's just who he is. And it's not even just people, it's animals, all right? So I go into the pantry and there's like these bags of apples. And I'm like, okay, well, we don't even eat apples. And he's like, no, they're for the neighbor's donkeys. I'm like, okay. So when we walk, we would go and take one apple, give one donkey one apple. And he's got all these bags, and now he wants to give them 2 apples each, one when we go up and one when we come back, because he's just that generous, okay? So anyway, that's a heart, but that's what this psalm is about. It's about someone with a merciful, giving heart. And what we learn from this psalm is how God views people who have hearts like my husband Rob does. And we see this in the Bible and other places, like Acts. We're going to see how God actually thinks about people who are generous. We come upon a man named Cornelius. He's a Roman centurion. And at the time, he wasn't Jewish. He's Roman. And, they worship, pagan, false gods and things like that. But he really wants to know the one true God. And so look at Acts 10, verse 30. Cornelius answered and said, 4 days ago, I was in my house praying at this hour. At 3 p.m, suddenly a man in shining clothes stood before me and said, Cornelius, God has heard your prayers and remembered your gifts to the poor. Like God sends an angel, okay? And then he sends Peter to Cornelius to tell him about Jesus. And Cornelius becomes, the first Roman Gentile believer, it seemed to. But it's interesting that they put this inside the verse, that, God has heard your prayers, but he also knows you're giving to the poor. And it's just a reminder that God actually does see when we do generous things for other people. But it's also this whole idea of sowing and reaping. It's like what we learned in our Genesis series, when Joseph's 10 older brothers who hated him sold him to traders on their way to Egypt. His brothers went home, they lied to their dad, said Joseph was dead, sorry dad, Joseph was killed by an animal. And what we see is that they sowed bitterness and anger and jealousy and hatred. And for the next 20 years, it would weigh heavy on their heart what they did. So we usually think of sowing and reaping in context of like the brothers, all right? They sowed bad stuff and they're going to reap bad stuff. It's kind of like if we sow jealousy, we're going to, reap our spouse divorcing us. Or if we sow greed, we may go to prison for doing something illegal, not paying taxes. But Joseph reminds us, and also David reminds us in this psalm, that there is a good side to sowing and reaping, this whole concept. And we see it with Joseph in Egypt, how he literally sowed the right things into his life. And he wasn't in Egypt for any fault of his own, but Joseph, he sowed integrity and he sowed work and he sowed caring for others and good ethics. And he never sowed bitterness and hatred for his brothers. And because of this, God blessed him in such amazing ways. And we saw that when God made him second in command to Pharaoh and gave him a new wife and children and favor and all of those kind of things. But we see this all in the Bible, the sowing and reaping concept. Look at Galatians 6:7. It says, "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." Galatians 6:9. "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Proverbs 11:18. "The wicked man earns deceptive wages, but he who sows righteousness reaps a sure reward." And David picks this up in this psalm, Psalm 41. So let's pick it up here. For the choir director, a psalm of David. Verse 1, "How blessed is he who considers the helpless. The Lord will deliver him in the day of trouble. The Lord will protect him and keep him alive, and he shall be called blessed upon the earth. And do not give him over to the desires of his enemy. The Lord will sustain him upon his sickbed. In his illness, you restore him to health." David reminds us that when we give, when we help, God actually repays that with blessings. Now, that doesn't mean if you give a homeless man $5 that you're never going to get sick. Giving is really a matter of the heart. It's not us doing nice things for people just so we can get a blessing. We see that weird stuff on TV or YouTube all the time, these religious shows that are like, if you give to our ministry, God's going to send you a blessing. And you're like, what? Yeah, it doesn't really work that way. Because people then suddenly give because they want something. They want the blessing. And if you think that through, then that becomes selfish on their part. Their giving actually is a selfish act because it's really not about helping someone. It's about they wanting something back for themselves. But it's kind of this heart of giving. Like when Rob gives, it never occurs to him that he'll ever get anything back. Like he just doesn't think that way. It's kind of like, God, you gave this to me, and so I want to help others. And because of that, God, I just know you're going to take care of us. And that's the heart behind giving. But sometimes, and some of you know this, like you've given and given and given, and you might not live in a mansion, you may live in a homeless shelter, okay? But the bottom line is God's going to take care of you wherever you are. That's just the way that this works. But the bottom line, and Rob knows this, is that God is the one who will always take care of us, regardless of what we give. But then David goes down another path. He knows God is gracious and giving because David has sinned. And he knows how merciful God can be to him. Verse 4 says this, "As for me, I said, O Lord, be gracious to me, heal my soul, for I have sinned against you." All right. So we see behind me this whole green, which is you can sow good things, or like where it's the dirt, you can, it's that whole sowing and reaping. If you sow good, it's going to reap. But David, like I said, David moves from that whole section to a section about sin. It's really fascinating that he doesn't break this into two different psalms, but he kind of combines them together. And I think it's because he knows when I sow sin, I'm going to reap things that are bad. But look at what's going on in David's life. In this particular point of the psalm, he's saying, "Heal my soul, God, because I've sinned against you." And whatever is going on in David's life, he sees that his enemies want him to die. Like, it's really fascinating. Look at verse 5. He says, "My enemies speak evil against me. When will he die and his name perish?" You're like, what? Why would they say that about David? Well, maybe they're jealous of him, okay? Maybe they were friends of Uriah, okay, who David made sure died on the front line so he could have Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. Like, we just don't know. But David is sick because of his sin. And his enemies are hoping that David actually dies. Verse 6, and when he comes to see me, he speaks falsehood. His heart gathers wickedness to himself. When he goes outside, he tells it. He's like, these people come and see me, and they're just like, gossip, 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 gossip. Verse 7 says, all those who hate me whisper together against me. Against me they devise my hurt, saying, a wicked thing is poured out upon him, that when he lies down, he will not rise up again. It's like they think God's going to punish David for whatever he's done. And they just kind of don't think he's going to live. But the problem isn't even David's enemies, all right? It's from people who now are his enemies, but used to be his really good friends. And some of you get this verse because maybe you had a really good friend who you trusted with all of your heart. And then they hurt you. They gossiped about you. They ruined your reputation. David gets your pain because this is what he says in verse 9. He's like, even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. It's like the saddest state. It's like they're kicking you when you're down. And you're like, but they used to be my friends. How could they do this to me? And so you get that. And David gets that too. I was thinking about this joke when I read this. There were 3 preachers from the same small town. And they went fishing together, and one of the pastors said, I know we're all pastors, different churches, but he said, I really feel safe with you guys. He said, I think it might be a good time for us to maybe, talk about our sin, confess our sin to each other, and, help us, pray for each other. And this is just a private thing between the 3 of us. So all the pastors agreed. So the first pastor said, well, I hate to admit it, but I kind of like to drink a little alcohol. So I do it alone in my home, and I do it every Saturday night, but I kind of just needed to confess it to someone. The second pastor said, well, I don't drink, and I never have, but I kind of like to gamble. He said, I bet on horse racing and football games all the time. He said, I'm so sorry that I have to admit that to you. The third pastor has not said a word by now, and the other 2 pastors said, come on, brother, we all agreed to share our sins. What's yours? The third pastor cleared his throat and said, well, brothers, I don't smoke or I don't drink, but I do like to gossip. And he said, and quite frankly, after hearing all this, I can't wait until I get back home. But there you go. All right, there's just some people like that. But for all of those who have been hurt deeply by someone, look at verse 10. But you, O Lord, be gracious to me and lift me up, that I might repay them. Now, I hope you get David's heart on this. I hope you have David's heart on this, because he didn't want to revengefully get back at them himself. But what David does say is that, I want to repay him with justice, not like harm or hurt or any of those things, but whatever these guys were doing to him was not right. And David wanted justice. And he wanted these ex-friends to know that God was gracious to him. God didn't kill him because of his sin, that God is awesome. God was pleased with him. David wanted his friends to know that, yeah, he did something wrong, but his God is awesome, and his God forgave him. But David did not want his enemies to think that he died because God was so angry with him. He didn't want them to think that his friends, he didn't want his friends to think that God was that way. Look at verse 11. By this I know that you're pleased with me, because my enemy does not shout in triumph over me. As for me, you uphold me in my integrity, and you set me in your presence forever. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. Amen and amen. So the lessons for today is this. What we learn is that how we treat people really does matter. Generosity matters to God. Not to get something in return, but a generous heart is a way to thank God for the blessings that he's given us. So go out of your way to tip someone, tip them extra if they're working hard or whatever, because you don't know anything about that person. Maybe it's a single mom that's your waitress, and this is her 3rd job, and she's doing everything that she can just to make it. You don't know that. You just never know what that person is going through that might need that extra little financial help. They may need an encouraging word. If you don't have finances, give them an encouraging word. And then this got us serious about sowing and reaping. David sowed sin, and we know he reaped the consequences, but David also sowed a lot of love for God. David sowed a love for his nation, Israel. And I believe that by God keeping David alive shows David that God really does love him and really does have a plan for his life. And David reaped good things because of his confession to God. And we see that David's enemies never triumphed over David. God made sure that that happened. So hopefully that's a good message for you today. So hope you have a really good day.